One of the most famous fossils ever found is a tiny skull sitting in the collection of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. It's only about an inch long and about 280 million years old. In other words, it is so small you could fit it in your pocket, and it is so old it predates the first dinosaurs by 35 million years. This mini marvel belonged to one of the earliest known mammals, something called a therapsid. Therapsids were a group of mammal-like reptiles that lived during the latter part of the Permian period. At that time, they were the closest relatives of mammals and arguably looked more like us than like reptiles. But even though they came before the official dawn of mammals, they weren't mammals themselves because they still laid eggs. So scientists refer to them as proto-mammals or mammal precursors. Now there are plenty of fossil sites that contain these ancient creatures, but none quite like the one we're talking about today. That's because the story of this fossil isn't just about the animal itself, it's also about how it died. And its death was both sudden and violent. The thing is, this particular fossil wasn't discovered in just regular old rock. It was found in volcanic ash. And this wasn't some small-scale eruption with a little lava here and there. No, this was a massive explosive eruption. The kind that produced a pyroclastic flow hot enough to melt rock and human bones alike. But even though this event was catastrophically deadly, it ended up preserving the details of the lives of the animals who were caught off guard by it. This fossil site really tells us how and why certain animals died out and others survived. And maybe most surprisingly of all, it gives us a glimpse at what life was like for those very first mammal-like creatures. In the late 1970s, paleontologists were excavating at a site in South Africa called the Golden Gate Highlands. There they unearthed the remains of a huge number of therapsids. At first glance, the site looked like your typical fossil quarry. The rocks were full of the skulls, jaws, and spines of ancient animals. But when researchers carefully cleaned and examined these fossils, they realized that the story behind this site was anything but typical. For starters, the animals had been found curled up in tight little balls. And that behavior was preserved down to their tiny snouts, which were touching their bellies. On top of that, their bodies were surrounded by ash, which had solidified into a type of glass called tektite. These details suggested that whatever killed these animals caught them off guard. They literally died without a chance to run away. It was also really odd that they had all been huddled together like this. Usually when animals are buried in sediment, they end up jumbled and mixed up. They get tossed around, dragged by flowing water, or trampled by herds of stampeding animals. Yet this wasn't the case here. They were neatly packed like sardines in a can, suggesting that they might have been sheltering together before whatever ultimately killed them. And lastly, it was weird that there were no whole skeletons. Every skeleton was destroyed and in some cases literally atomized, leaving behind only fragments of bone. All of this pointed to one really bizarre conclusion: they were buried alive in a cloud of hot ash. Okay, let's rewind a bit and talk about what the world was like back when these animals lived. About 300 million years ago, there were two large land masses called Gondwana and Laurasia. As their names suggest, they would later break apart and drift to form the supercontinent Pangaea. But at the time, they were joined together by a narrow strip of land that connected them near what is now South Africa. This region had a ton of active volcanoes, meaning that minor earthquakes and eruptions were part of everyday life. And one day, a volcano erupted with such violence that it created a gigantic caldera. A caldera is basically a giant bowl-shaped depression that's left behind after an eruption. But this caldera was more than 10 kilometers wide, meaning that it was absolutely massive. The explosion blast was so strong that it ejected over 4,000 cubic kilometers of material. For scale, that's about 4 times the volume of Mount St. Helens, one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the United States. And to put that in perspective, the Mount St. Helens eruption is considered pretty big. It was the deadliest eruption in U.S. history, killing 57 people. So needless to say, this mega eruption in South Africa was a truly catastrophic event. But unlike most volcanoes, which sit atop tall mountains, this one was situated in a low-lying area. And that meant that the massive amounts of ash it spewed forth flowed outward in all directions. These pyroclastic flows engulfed vast areas of land, burying entire forests beneath thick layers of ash. And it was this deluge of ash that killed so many therapsids. The main part of the eruption probably happened over the course of a few days. But after that, smaller eruptions continued to pepper the landscape for another 2,000 years. Because of this, these deposits are up to 60 meters thick in some places. And the amount of ash alone would have been enough to kill just about anything in its path. But there was another extremely dangerous substance hiding within the ash clouds: carbon dioxide. As the ash flowed through forests, it smothered plants, blocking their ability to photosynthesize and do pretty much everything else they need to survive. And it also released tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And given that back then Earth's atmosphere contained about half as much oxygen as it does today, this meant that the air quickly became unbreathable. If you were outside, you would have suffocated. If you were inside your cozy burrow, you would have suffocated. If you were hanging out in a herd of mammal-like reptiles, well, you get the picture. Not only did these therapsids die from the effects of the ash and carbon dioxide, but they were also crushed by falling trees. So if you were curled up in a ball trying to protect yourself, you probably wouldn't have survived. But strangely enough, the very thing that led to their demise also helped preserve their bodies. You see, when a body decays, it releases methane, which causes the body to bloat. This makes the body more flexible, which allows it to contort and scatter when it's moved by moving water or trampling animals. But these therapsids didn't just die and explode. They died while they were curled up in a ball, which kept their bodies rigid. Their stiff carcasses were easily transportable, which is why they were found so neatly grouped together. And because they were bundled up, their remains stayed intact instead of getting scattered. Plus, the ash itself also helped preserve their bodies. Ash is mildly acidic, which stops decomposition in its tracks. And in some cases, it actually fused to the skeletons of these animals, creating a sort of natural plaster that encased them. To make matters even weirder, this plaster contains a high concentration of uranium, which is radioactive. Uranium is often used in nuclear reactors to produce energy. But in this case, it served as a natural preservative. In other words, the environment that killed them was so extreme and so bizarre that it was able to preserve their bodies in place, giving us an unprecedented look at these ancient creatures. At the end of the day, we have a rare glimpse at life and death during the last days of the Permian. These therapsids were trying to huddle together for warmth in the face of an unrelenting disaster, totally unaware that they were living through the sixth mass extinction event in Earth's history. They were caught in a perfect storm of earthquakes, ash falls, tsunamis, and non-stop volcanic activity. And the fact that we can learn so much about them is a testament to how incredible these ancient animals really are. If you like learning about the amazing animals that lived long ago, be sure to subscribe for more prehistoric pals.